Hey there, and welcome to Now and Men. This is a new podcast series to discuss what it's like to be a man in the 21st century and how feminist issues are relevant to the lives of men and boys. It's been set up by researchers in the Centre for Research into Violence and Abuse at Durham University in the UK. My name is Dr. Stephen Burrell, and I'm a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow. The podcast is mainly hosted by myself and Sandy Ruxton, who's an Honorary Research Fellow. Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Stephen. So each episode is going to be based around a conversation with an expert. That could be a practitioner, an activist, an academic, someone who's got an in-depth knowledge of the issues we're going to be looking at. And we'll be asking them about their work and the research they're doing, as well as exploring their own personal experiences of doing work related to masculinity and gender equality and how they got involved in the area. Enjoy the episode.
So in today's episode, we're going to be talking to Nikki van der Gaag, who's a feminist writer and researcher specialising in gender and development, and has been working on these issues for many years. Nikki has a particular interest on men and masculinities in relation to gender equality, and she's written an excellent book called Feminism and Men, published by Z Books in 2014, as well as a book called The No-Nonsense Guide to Feminism in 2017, and other books as well. She currently works as an independent consultant, and until 2019 was the Director of Gender Justice and Women's Rights at Oxfam, Great Britain.
Yes, I've obviously worked with Nikki often in the past, and currently we're both on the steering committee for MenEngage Europe, which is a network of civil society organisations working with men and boys for gender justice and gender equality. She's also been the principal author of several of the State of the World's Girls report published by Plan International, and has been a lead author on several of the State of the World's Fathers reports too. And those are produced by the Global Men Care campaign, which is led by organisations such as Promundo and Sonki Gender Justice.
Yeah, and so today we're going to be talking to Nikki about all of these different issues and some of the exciting pieces of work that she's been involved in.
So welcome to Now and Men, Nikki. As I said, you've been co-author or lead author on several. Is it 4 of the State of the World's Fathers reports?
Yeah, 4.
That reflects your wider interest in issues around care. The latest of the reports was published in June this year. So why is it that you, a pretty well-known feminist, are now working on fatherhood and on care issues?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Good question. I think I probably would take it further back than there, in the sense that I began by looking at feminist issues around care and unpaid care in particular a number of years ago. And that also coincided with one of the State of the World's Girls reports that you mentioned. I think I'd done about 4 by then. And every time I went to a country to do the research, I would talk to these wonderful young women, and there would be these boys bobbing around outside. So, I remember one sitting in one health centre, and the boys were kind of literally jumping up at the window. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, actually, even if you only think about this gender equality from a point of view of the girls, they're going to end up marrying those boys. And so you have to start working with those boys. So I eventually persuaded Plan that we should do a State of the World's Girls on boys. And I think that was probably where my real interest in the work began, which was probably about 2007. And the more I looked into it, the more obvious it seemed to me as a feminist and someone who'd worked for many years on women's rights that, unless we involve men and boys, we weren't going to achieve the things that we wanted to achieve. And the fatherhood piece, I guess, came out of, State of the World's Fathers came out of an evaluation I was doing of the Men Care campaign, which actually is going to be 10 years old this year. I was actually in the local swimming pool, swimming up and down, because I get a lot of my ideas when I'm exercising. And I thought, there's a State of the World's Mothers, there's a State of the World's Girls, there's a State of the World's Children, there's no State of the World's Fathers. And so the whole idea came from that swimming pool moment, and we had no idea it was going to take off like that. So I guess since then, I've got 2 kids, I've got a partner who's a father, I've now got a son-in-law who's a father. So there's lots of personal and as well as professional things that came together for me around unpaid care and fatherhood.
And thanks for that background. That's very interesting, and particularly your eureka moment in the swimming pool as well. I'm very glad you actually had that. But and we can talk a bit more about State of the World's Fathers later on. But you mentioned your family and your children, and we thought it'd be interesting to know a bit more about how your own experience of being a parent of a son and a daughter. How do you think that has shaped your thinking about care issues, about fatherhood more generally?
I think quite a lot. I mean, partly because I was lucky enough to have one of each gender. And one of the things I wrote about in the Feminism and Men book was remembering that an occasion when my son was about 7, and I was already working on. He's now grown up. I was already working on women's rights quite a lot, and so he said to me, "Mum, you're obsessed with women's rights. What about men? What about me?" And that, wasn't the only moment, but that was one of the moments where I thought, actually, I need to start putting this together. And wanting the same choices for my daughter as for my son, and wanting it for the young men and women that I met in all these different places I was traveling to as well. I think that really kind of was another one of my eureka moments in recognizing personally, that I wanted to do something. I don't know how successful I've been, but
well, according to your book, you had that eureka moment with your son in the supermarket. So it's as you go around your daily life that these ideas come upon you, do they?
Sometimes.
I can definitely attest to swimming as being a good generator of thoughts. The only problem then is you can't actually write down the ideas that you have. But yeah, so we're also interested, I suppose, in the kind of personal stories of the people that we're speaking to on Now and Men. So if it's okay, we'll be interested in kind of going back to your own childhood as well. Can you perhaps tell us a little bit about when and where you were born, where you were brought up? What was life and society like at that point in time?
So, as you probably gathered from my name, I'm half Dutch. My dad was Dutch. And I only came to England when I was 15. We'd lived in a number of different countries. And I think that definitely made me interested in languages and culture and sociology and whatever from a very young age. I was actually, I spent my first 2 years in Spain. And I'm old enough to have that been the end of the period where Spain was under Franco's rule. And my mum always describes it as a third world country. Then she said she couldn't get hold of anything. I've been working with her on her life story, and it's really interesting hearing what Spain was like, at the end of 50s, beginning of the 60s, and how different it was. And also as a mother, my mum couldn't phone her mum when she was stuck. She couldn't speak to anybody. She had a very isolating time with me as I was the eldest. I'm the eldest of 4. And I think it wasn't very easy for her those first couple of years. And I think I was also brought up in an era where the boys were given the outside jobs and the girls did the inside jobs. So observations around unpaid care came quite early on there. And I don't think necessarily that us girls were expected to have careers even. I think my mum definitely wanted me to get married and wasn't terribly delighted when I went to university, although my dad was. So yeah, lots of things about my own personal experience that I think I didn't realize at the time, but gradually informed my feminism. And then when I got to university, it kind of all exploded. There were so many ideas around there. There were amazing, I guess, first wave feminists that I was reading and learning and talking to people about. And I think probably my feminism, really got rooted when I was 18 or 19.
And what about what can you say a little bit more perhaps about your parents? What did they do? What were their backgrounds? Was there anything about their approach to parenting perhaps which, had an impact on you? Or
Well, my dad worked, they were quite a traditional Western family in the sense that my dad worked for a company that took him around the world, and my mum stayed at home and looked after the 4 kids. So, in some ways she had a quite extraordinary life because she was a kind of middle-class girl from Sussex, and she met this foreigner, bloody foreigner, apparently my grandfather called him. It's not just now that we suffer from xenophobia in this country. And went off to Spain with him. So I'm not sure how much I can say about how that influenced, what I'm doing now. I think I was always a bit of a rebel. I was always getting into trouble about one thing or another. And I think as the eldest child, you bear particular kind. There's actually been some interesting research, slightly tangential, but I've been involved for about 10 years in a project based at Oxford University that's a longitudinal study of child poverty. And I've been working with them on gender and communications for quite a long time. It's called Young Lives, and it's in Ethiopia, Peru, Vietnam, and India. And the reason I'm bringing it up is that one of the things the research is showing is that the position in the family, as my position as the elder child, very much affects gendered expectations and gendered roles. And I think that's something that hasn't been looked into in any very deep way elsewhere. And so it's very interesting how that's coming up. And I guess, that reflects back to me being the eldest child too, and feeling that I was responsible for everything, but also blamed for everything.
Yeah, that is fascinating, isn't it? Like the dynamics of families, and I think you're right. That does have a big impact, doesn't it? And can you perhaps say a little bit more about that? Anything in particular which sticks out in your mind that you kind of learnt about gender and being a girl, being a woman, like as you were growing up. Whether that's at school or at university, for example. Were there any particular people that had a big impact on you in that regard?
I have an uncle who was an academic, so not in terms of gender, but just being able to see that people were interested in ideas, I think was really important to me at that point. And and then at university, getting into university at that stage, I went to university here at Oxford, and then the numbers, there were, I think, 5 women's colleges, and a tiny handful of women compared to the men. And it used to really strike you a lot in lectures and in seminars. And I went to St Hugh's College, which was only a women's college at that point, but women weren't. Mostly, I think there were 2 mixed colleges, so it was a very different era. And I did English, and we only studied English up to 1945, and we mainly only studied dead white men. So all that kind of informed me at the time. And meanwhile, I was reading voraciously. I was reading, Simone de Beauvoir. I was reading Gloria Steiner, Betty Friedan, Dale Spender, but also, novels by women like Marge Piercy and Ursula Le Guin, who very much wrote from a women's perspective, and I think had a huge influence on my thinking as well.
Is there anything you would say you think that that led you to be drawn to feminism in that way? Like, and what was it that led you to want to start actually, to taking action about it as well, to start kind of working on these issues as well as kind of studying them, I suppose?
I'm just trying to think about my kind of, when I first started out. I went to India when I was in my 20s. In fact, I did quite a lot of traveling in my 20s. And I went to work on a magazine. My original training was as a journalist, not as a development person. But I went to work on a magazine called Time Out in Bombay, which actually was run from a tiny village not very close to Bombay. So I spent a lot of time on the train and a lot of time volunteering in women's projects and meeting the most amazing women with so few resources and, incredible resilience. And my limited Marathi at the time, the stories they used to tell about their lives and the things that they did. I think that kicked me off both with women's rights and with development in a much more grounded way, and determined to come back and do something about it when I got back to the UK.
So would you say it was a kind of very much a kind of gradual process of becoming more involved, or was that quite a sudden moment for you where you were like, yes, now this is what I want to do, basically?
I don't know that it was sudden. I think it's like often these things are incremental. I edited a feminist magazine when I was at university. I was interested in all those ideas, but it became more of a practical reality on the ground, I think, after I got back from India. And even then, I wasn't particularly working on gender at that point. It was more of a passion, really, and something that imbued everything else that I did.
It's very interesting, your journey there. But I think we should talk about your work and your books as well. In your 2014 book on Feminism and Men, you argue that feminism has radically reshaped the lives of women, but you raise key questions about the impact of feminism on men. I mean, you've said something about the impetus for the book, but how would you characterize the response of men, of different groups of men as well, to feminism? And how do you think feminism can contribute to improving the lives of men as well as women?
I mean, I think you've put your finger on something really important, is that we often lump all men and all women together. And it's absolutely clear to anybody who works on gender, as both of you do, that men as well as women are affected by class, race, geography, sexuality, disability, how much money they've got, and all sorts of things like that. And that therefore, lumping all men together is just not something that's very useful. But I think, I'm answering a slightly different question, but I think one of my reasons for doing the book was, having done the report on Boys for Plan and continuing to read and research, it really struck me that, there were so many interesting initiatives and books and reports on feminism. There was a much smaller growing body of work on masculinities, to which both of you are contributors, but there was really very little that brought the two together. And because I felt very strongly that if men weren't involved in gender equality, then gender equality was going to get stuck. And even talking to, feminists in the global south, who basically say, look, most women live with men. You can't pretend, like the girls I met in Pakistan. So most women live with men, and therefore we have to think about how the two interact. So what I was trying to do was a book that was not an academic book, was a book that, a lay person, that anybody who might be interested in, who might be a man interested in, well, what's feminism all about, or might be a feminist thinking about what does men have to do with feminism, would buy and try and make it accessible, as well as kind of, got stories and charts and things like that. And I think the interesting thing that I hadn't quite realized was that my feminist friends now and then still find it a bit iffy that I'm working with blokes. And I think on the other hand, you've got, a spectrum of people working with men, some of whom are very much pro gender equality, like the MenEngage Alliance that you were talking about earlier, Sandy. And yet we're also seeing this increasing backlash, moving and shaping and taking different forms, of men who think feminism is anathema and feminists are to blame for everything awful that's going on in the world. So I guess I was trying in my way to explore those areas that seem to be quite separate, and to bring them together.
Well, I think that's undoubtedly a very important endeavour. But I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about what you think men can and should contribute to gender equality and to feminist or pro-feminist activism as well.
Yeah, and I think it's a very moot point, because we've had lots of discussions around, can men be feminist or pro-feminist, and how can men be allies in this place when very often it's under a patriarchal system, it's men who have the power, and therefore how easy is it to be an ally if you're the person in positions of power? And I think it is tricky, and it's challenging, and it's contradictory, and it's exciting. I think the ways that men can get involved are often very practical, and I'll talk a bit about that when we come to talk a bit about this year's State of the World's Fathers. But so if you take unpaid care as the lens through which you look at this, I think some of the work in a number of different countries, I think there are now 50 countries that have got various kinds of programs on men's involvement in unpaid care. Just seeing how those evolve and seeing how that changes relationships between men and women. It also changes men in terms of how they think about the home and how they think about their children, and how they're able to, all the things that we're talking about men not being able to do in traditional masculinity. I don't really like that word, but, not being in touch with their emotions, and, not seeing the pile of laundry on the stairs. All those things can change. So it's if this is done right, if you can say it's done right, there's such potential for all genders and children as well to benefit, I think. But it has to be trod very, it's very easy also, and I've certainly been on lots of platforms where ostensibly talking about gender equality in men, and the men do all the talking. So, it's not an easy space to work in, but that's why I find it interesting, because it's challenging and it's difficult, but it's really important.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I concur wholeheartedly with some of your opinions you've just expressed there. But one other thing I wanted to ask you about the Feminism and Men book is I understand you're going to be producing a second edition of it. And so, well, why is that? And is that because you think things have changed significantly over the last 6-7 years since you wrote the first edition?
I think I'd like to look at what has changed. So looking at it again, I think some of those chapters probably need the statistics updating, but they still stand for me. But I wrote this book before Trump was elected. And, I only have to say that for you both to be able to imagine how much has changed. I mean, this symposium, Ubuntu symposium that MenEngage Alliance has had over the last 7 months, I've been involved in a series on backlash with some really fantastic feminist speakers and researchers and academics talking about, how this kind of authoritarian model in so many countries, and I think coinciding with, increasing inequality, increasing poverty in many ways, has led to blaming feminism for everything. Denigrating women. It's led to increased misogyny. We don't have to look very far for that. But it's also led to that being linked to men saying, well, it's all the fault of feminism, which was always there. But I'm really interested in exploring what these what impact these authoritarian regimes have had, both on men and on feminism and gender equality.
I think you kind of answered one of the things I was going to ask you, which was about your follow-up book, The No Nonsense Guide to Feminism, where you say in the introduction that the book explains the gains and losses, the challenges and setbacks associated with being a feminist in the world today. And so you've talked a bit there about some of the gains and losses and why they might be happening. But I wondered how the pandemic fits into that story as well. I mean, you mentioned how the backlash is playing out, but do you think COVID has had a particular impact, and if so, how, in reinforcing patriarchy?
Yeah, I mean, it's all we've all been working on in some ways for the last year and a half, and I've written blogs and done quite a lot of research, including for State of the World's Fathers, about the impact of COVID on gender equality. And if you take again that lens of unpaid care, it's quite clear that men have got more involved in the home in many countries because they've been there. But that's also led first of all, women are still doing more. There was a Guardian article today, actually, that had interviewed women in the UK, and I meant to bring it in with me. But I think it said something like 76% of women said they've been doing X% more. And when they were asked what men have been doing, they were saying, well, the men took out the dustbins. Now, I think that's slightly countered by the research by the Fatherhood Institute here in the UK, which has shown that men have been doing more under lockdown, but there's nowhere that they've done as much as women. And I think that there are some really scary things happening, both in terms of an epidemic of increase in domestic violence that we've seen all over the world and been very, as well monitored as you can monitor violence against women in the home. Huge disproportion between the numbers of women losing their jobs and the numbers of men losing their jobs as the result of the pandemic. Increase in child marriage. I mean, it is potentially quite scary. I think we still don't know what's going to happen, and there are various bodies like UN Women and UNDP who've developed gender trackers to look at what policies have changed under the pandemic. But I think we need to keep a really, really close eye on gender equality in the pandemic, and that involves keeping a close eye and holding men to account for keeping up with those kind of involvements in the home that they had before. Because actually, if women are the ones doing the work at home, or indeed if women are the ones who take up the options on flexible working and men don't so much, then again it's the men who are going to get those most senior jobs, and we're going to see a real widening of inequality in terms of gender as well as in terms of a lot of other things. Race and class, we've seen that as well. But I don't want to end completely on a negative note, because I think there's also some really interesting things around, movements coming together. I mean, even in my street, I've met, because of our community WhatsApp, I'm a street champion. So I've met people in my street that I haven't met living here for more than 20 years.
Yeah.
And, Black Lives Matter, young people coming, there've been some really important initiatives that have the potential for positive change, and we need to hang on to that as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, perhaps we can move on then to looking a little bit more at these State of the World's Fathers reports that you've worked on. Could you perhaps just tell us a little bit, first of all, about what is this project? How did it come about in the first place? I mean, obviously you've said where the idea came from, but if you can perhaps say a little bit more about its purpose, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the original purpose was simple. It was to fill a gap, and it fitted very well with the kind of principles of the Men Care campaign, which works on care in different countries around the world. But I think when we wrote, so I was involved in writing. I've been involved in writing all four, but the very first one, we had no idea whether there would be any interest whatsoever. There had been programs on fatherhood. Men Care had programs on fatherhood. I think we were really surprised by the uptake. So we launched it at the UN. I got to meet Chelsea Clinton, we just weren't expecting the kind of attention that it got, that first one. And because it was new and different media people like new and different. But also, I mean, the thing that I guess has excited me most is that it spawned state of X countries' fathers reports, state of regional fathers reports. I mean, lots of them. I think Uganda and Tanzania have just produced two of their national reports, and those have been used to lobby for national policy change. So one of the things that we did in the 2017 report was I helped to write a parental leave platform, and in South Africa they used that to lobby for more parental leave, not just for fathers, but for all genders, and also for adoptive fathers, stepfathers, and it took them, I think, 4 years. So Sonke Gender Justice were involved, but so were Mosaic and a lot of other women's rights organisations, and they won. I mean, they didn't win everything they wanted to, and the same in the Netherlands. And I'm not saying State of the World's Fathers was the only impetus for that, but I think it's been a useful international tool for many countries to both to produce their own reports, but also to use them to say, hey, this is something that the world is interested in. Please, my government, sit up and take notice. And that feels really important to me.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because the picture does vary a lot across the world, doesn't it? In that regard, I mean, is there anything there which you found particularly interesting, perhaps in the latest report? Things coming out in different parts of the world, and I mean, is there anything in particular, in the report or in your work on this, which you think is especially important, for governments to be doing, for example, about increasing men's involvement in caregiving, whether that's internationally or here in the UK?
So I'll answer that one first. I mean, in the UK, the most obvious thing to say is about parental leave and paternity leave, and it has to be what's often called daddy days. There have to be days for fathers to do solo care and which are not transferable to the mother, and it has to be absolutely clear that it doesn't take away from maternity leave. So I think lobbying around parental leave, and in this country we have shared parental leave, but it's quite clear that it's not working. And there are some really good organisations like Maternity Action, who have been lobbying for a long time for change. So, parental paternity leave, both in terms of national policies, but also I think in terms of businesses. In some businesses are beginning to kind of, look at flexible work and looking at parental leave in the same way that they look at diversity as a positive thing. This is something to encourage and support workers. And if it's so important that men take it up. So we've, parental leave, I would say, is the first thing. One of the things that we did in this report, partly as a result of discussions within the MenEngage movement about the fact that a lot of programming inevitably works with individual men and women, or with communities, and works around changing attitudes and changing behaviours, but doesn't necessarily look at more structural change. So there's been some critique of the idea that you could promote fatherhood. I mean, in Eastern Europe, this has been happening a lot. You could promote fatherhood and motherhood in a way that then reinforces the idea of a traditional family with the mother back in the kitchen and the dad going out to work. So if you're working on fatherhood, you need to be really, really aware and really careful of that, because you can play into some of these, right-wing populist, anti-feminist, anti-gender agendas by talking about fatherhood. So rather than necessarily just talking about individual fathers, although I think that's important, we tried to look at what were the more structural things in this that we could recommend in this report that could actually begin to change things. And none of them have changed anything hugely yet, I have to say. But, national care policies was one of them. And we looked at Uruguay, which is trying to promote a whole range of national care policies that do include men. Still limited success, but it's there, and they're shaping and moving things. And I think it's a really good example. Parental leave I talked about. Changes in social protection programs. So I'm talking about the wider inequalities that we see in the world, and social protection programs are there. They're the kind of things that are there to support those most in need, and they're often not gendered. Changes in the health sector, there's been some success with working on policies. For example, in Brazil, there are programs in place to support the law which says that men should now be involved at birth. And what they do is they work with doctors and nurses and health providers, and they do that in a number of other Latin American countries too, actually. And they also give men a health checkup when they come in with the woman for her antenatal. So, there are lots of things that might seem quite small. I think at the Fatherhood Institute, I was talking to Adrian Burgess and Kathy Jones, and they were saying they call it the Trojan horse approach. So, these small changes that kind of are both at policy level but at practical level can bring about a lot of change as well. And then, thinking about care in terms of men's attitudes and behaviour and women's attitudes and behaviour, because women are often also blockers to men being involved, looking at the workplace, and then looking at political support. So we had quite an interesting discussion about that in terms of, you could say, well, let's just get men to support more care policies or to support more women in political leadership. But actually you need women to do the same. It's not as straightforward as just saying, let's get men to do this and let's get more women in. Not all women in politics are going to support care policies either. So it's a question of looking at who does and who doesn't. So we were trying to look at those more structural things that could begin to shift things. And some of them we knew did, and some of them we're still experimenting with, I guess. I had a first part to your question that I've forgotten. So
No, that's brilliant. That's fascinating. Thank you. And yeah, there's lots of important issues there, isn't there? I mean, one thing which you mentioned comes to my mind during the pandemic, that there's been a real issue in the UK, hasn't there, about, like fathers or birth partners being able to accompany like the mother when she's giving birth in hospital, and which is, I think, is really, that's really can be really detrimental, isn't it? And even now, apparently, that's still an issue. That you had like 60,000. I saw on Twitter somebody saying, you've got 60,000 people in Wembley attending a football match, but a father still can't attend the birth of their child in some hospitals. But yeah, one thing I was just wondering in relation to that, like if there's like an individual man, who's a father, like listening to this podcast, like, is there any message that you would want to give to him about like what could he do to help? Through the lens of fatherhood, to help promote gender equality, would you say?
I think the first thing I'll pick up on is that word help.
Yeah.
Because actually what often happens is it's framed men helping in the home. And actually what I would argue really strongly is this should be about equality in the home. This should be about men doing as much as women. And they may do different things. I certainly know in my own life we have different jobs in the house. You know, I do the laundry, my partner does the cooking. But being aware of that. And then the other thing that I think I became much more aware of when I was at Oxfam, because Oxfam has a really interesting program called We Care on unpaid care in a number of different countries that looks at research and programming and policy change. And also, so the research measures in many different countries the amount of time spent by women and men on different tasks. And that's been done elsewhere too. But one of the things it's picked up on is that women are often multitasking. So how do you count that? And B, what's known in the jargon as the mental load. So it's the planning and the thinking about and the remembering the night before that the homework needs to go into the school bag. And those tend to be the things that men just don't compute. I'm generalizing, but you know, so I think a message would be, don't think about yourself as helping if you're a bloke. Think about yourself as sharing this. Have conversations about who's doing what, and try and get yourself into a mindset where you're actually part of that. You negotiate that planning piece as well, because that actually takes up an awful lot of time and energy. And you know, I'm specifically talking, I guess, about people in nuclear households in the West. It's very, very different in lots of other households. But I think, you know, those would be the thing. You know, talk, share, don't use the word help. And I think the other thing that feminists often do as well is to talk about care as a burden. And yeah, some of it is, absolutely. But as soon as you talk about care as a burden, you undervalue it. And I think that lies at the heart of why we aren't paying our care workers a proper wage. It lies at the heart of why women do all that work, not just biological. It's because we don't value it. So, you know, if men would value care in whatever they do, I think that will make a huge difference.
I think we are probably coming to the end of our time. So I just wanted to ask you a couple of things to end with. The first one was a more general question, really, about what contemporary developments in relation to gender and the issues we've been talking about give you cause for concern or possibly a sense of optimism. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think a lot of work around feminist, I don't know whether they call it principles or leadership, but a lot of work that young women are doing to really think intersectionally about what feminism means, so that we get beyond the idea that feminism is this white Western thing. And a lot of that is happening. It's happening driven by young people like the Frida Fund, who are doing some fantastic work. And that's really important. I feel really hopeful about that, bringing about some changes in real mindset thinking. So issues around race and thinking about race, really important for white people as well. I've been involved in a number of different kind of webinars over the last year, you know, that have been challenging and importantly challenging and making me feel uncomfortable. And that's really important too. So I think, you know, things around youth, things around race, joining up of different campaigns. So, you know, I've done a bit of work, not a huge amount, but on masculinities and climate change. You know, how do we gender some of these issues? Well, they are already gendered. How do we make it manifest that all these things are gendered and what the implications of those are?
It's good that you're ending there on a sense of positivity. It's clear from your work that you would describe yourself as a feminist, but do you think that men can be feminists?
So it's a question I'm asked a lot, and I guess I slightly prevaricate in the sense that I'm really not that fussed what people call themselves. I think it's what you do and how you behave that's important. So, you know, if men want to call themselves feminists and they can prove that they are, then I don't have a problem with it. I think if they want to call themselves pro-feminist, that's also fine, because that makes that distinction between the lived experience of being, you know, in a woman and being a man. Now I'm being very binary, I know, but I think it's fine to call yourself pro-feminist as well. I sit on the fence slightly about the language, but not about the principle.
Okay, that sounds like a good place to end. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today, Nikki. That was great, and will be a very interesting listen for everybody.
Very much, Sandy, and thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you. Take care.
So, Stephen, what did you make of that interview with Nikki there? She covered a lot of ground, didn't she?
Yeah, it was fascinating. So much interesting work that Nikki's doing. So many interesting issues that she raised. There's a lot of things which come to my mind. I mean, one thing which she mentioned, which I think is really important, was how what she said about how we talk about care. The care work is sometimes presented as being this kind of burden, and of course, as she pointed out, like it's incredibly hard work sometimes. But yeah, I'm also not very comfortable with that language about it being a burden, because actually I think, for me, from my perspective, what could be more meaningful and important and valuable really than caring for other human beings and having close emotional connections with other people, whether that's your children or other family members or friends or people in your community. So I thought that was a really good point that she made there about this language of care being a burden, perhaps that we should try and move away from that and celebrate it. What did you think?
Well, do you think we should be calling it responsibility really rather than burden?
Yeah, I think that's right. And as Nikki made the point as well, that men have a responsibility to play to play an equal part in that, to share that, as she said, rather than this idea as well of men just kind of helping out, or sometimes people talk about fathers like babysitting their children as well, which is obviously definitely not the kind of idea which is very helpful really. So no, I think responsibility is a more helpful word there. Yeah.
There was a couple of things that struck me as particularly interesting. I mean, one of them is that her experience, her work, is primarily through the lens of sort of international development, and so she draws upon examples and experiences from a very wide range of countries. And of course, in some ways, that's a great strength, to have that sort of wide focus. Having said that, the only question I have is about the notion that masculinity or masculinities are kind of lived locally as well as on the national or international scale, and they play out very differently at different levels as well. And so I think one has to be sensitive both to that dimension of masculinity theory and research, as well as being able to talk about experience in different countries. So I think we will actually be interviewing somebody on the podcast in future called Mike Ward, who works at Swansea University, and his work is very much grounded in the local, I think, and he's written quite a lot about place. So I think that could be quite an interesting contrast to today's interview with Nikki. And the other thing that I picked up, which I thought was fascinating, was when she talked about her own life. She said that she was a bit of a rebel when she was a child. And in a way, I mean, I don't want to be too sort of linear about it, but there she is, making trouble as a feminist in her adult career and her writing and research, and I just thought that was an interesting reflection that, that sort of rebelliousness has persisted throughout her life. So it appears anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I really like thinking about it in that way as well, because I think often perhaps those of us working in this area, we spend a lot of time thinking about, how can we make feminism and pro-feminism, accessible to like a wide audience or to policymakers, and could perhaps sometimes lose sight of the fact that it is also about creating trouble, right, and upsetting, established power relations and kind of troubling those in different ways. So I think that it's very political and challenging, and that's important to remember. Yeah.
I don't see you as a natural rebel, Stephen, but maybe you are. What do you say?
That's a very good question. I suppose there's a point there as well about we all can practice feminism and pro-feminism in our own way, right? We all have a contribution to make, even if we don't see ourselves as a natural rebel, perhaps.
Hey, look, as I've got older, I'm beginning to wonder whether I should actually have been a little bit more rebellious. And in fact, you remember Tony Benn saying he was pleased he left Parliament so he could spend more time on his politics. And maybe as one gets older, you can start to explore some of these in a bit more of a rebellious.
Absolutely. And actually, I think there's an
spirit.
interesting point there as well about, for men engaging with feminism, which is about rebellion. Obviously, yes, there's an element there of rebelling against masculinity, for example, but also there's an element of listening more and taking a step back as well. So perhaps that idea of rebellion is quite complicated when it comes to men and feminism. But yeah, that's something we can perhaps explore further. Thank you. Yeah, we can perhaps explore that in future episodes, but for now, it's goodbye and thank you very much for listening.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Now and Men. Any references we mentioned will all be in the show notes.
You're welcome to email us at nowandmen@gmail.com if you'd like to ask us questions or suggest a guest.
And we're really keen that the podcast should be listened to by as many people as possible to encourage more men to think about issues of masculinity and gender equality. So please do follow Now and Men so the latest episode drops in your podcast feed as soon as it's released. You can also leave a review and share it among your friends and colleagues. And look out for our next episode coming soon.
So you take care of each other, and speak to you again soon.